Communications Director of the Republican National Committee. He joins our panel. Nice to see you. We liked your musical choice a little bit earlier this morning. So explain the contradiction in those two graphics. 55%, they don't particularly care for who's running. 66% say don't want a brokered convention.
I think actually, if you start to really look at the numbers, there's a lot of agreement on our side in terms of that we want to replace Barack Obama and everyone's going to be unified. I think there's a lot of folks that have two choices. They say, well, I want to vote for this person, but here's my second choice. And so if you go real deep into the numbers, I think there is actual satisfaction with the four candidates that we have. One of them will be our nominee, and they will go on to victory in November.
Okay, so let me stop you there for a second, because there are many people now talking about this letter that's being circulated, the deadline for states, and the certain math that can be done with the primaries that are late enough where you could get your filing in so that you could run as a candidate. There are 14 states, which is roughly 700 delegates, and you could enter the race, right? All that is math. That's for someone who is right this moment not in the race to enter the race. Is that true? Is that correct?
I'll be honest with you, I've spent about as much time thinking about that as I have winning Powerball.
Really? Well, you might be winning Powerball, sir.
Well, I think so. That the reality, it's who is this magical person? I think that there is satisfaction with the four candidates. They're doing a great job out there bringing the case to the people. But there are a lot of folks who sit around and say, well, what if and what if? Who is this person that they're speaking of?
Okay, well, let's throw up some names. Okay, so here are some names that have been, and I'm not making these up. These are names that have been discussed consistently. Chris Christie, Jeb Bush,
who said no.
Paul Ryan, Mitch Daniels. Mitch Daniels' spokesperson says that the knocking on the door has become a pounding on the door to get him to enter the race.
Okay, and every one of those folks has said no. But let's put this in perspective. We have a total of 2,288 delegates at stake. 4 states that actually award delegates have voted. So if you think about it in terms of a sports season, it's a 56-game schedule, 56 states and territories. 4 have voted. A total of 113 delegates have been awarded. We are in the first couple games of a season here, and people are trying to figure out the playoffs and the World Series or the Super Bowl.
Okay, I buy that. Actually, I'm not really good with sports analogies usually, but that one was a very good one. Okay, let me throw another one back at you that not in analogy form, which is, what happens if Mitt Romney loses the state of Michigan? That's the big game, is coming up soon. And if that big game is lost, does that not spell trouble for getting to the end?
Look, I don't mean to, I'm not trying to get around the question. At the RNC, our job isn't to figure out who's going to be the winner of the nominee. Our job is to prep the field, if you will, to put the money in the bank, to get the organization and the message ready so that when we have that nominee,
but that's kind of a dodge, with all due respect. And I know, I could tell because you preface it by saying, I'm not trying to avoid the question, and then you kind of avoided the question. So what happens in Michigan? What happens?
Right, but in other words, I'm not here to decide, what happens if one candidate wins or loses. Each candidate and the voters have to make a decision. That's not our job. And frankly, for too long, I think people have said, people in Washington, the RNC, the establishment, if you will, have gotten in the way of this process. So Chairman Priebus and the RNC have made it very clear. Our job is not to get in the way of this process. The voters will make the decision as to who the nominee is, and the candidates will decide for themselves whether they stay in or stay out of the race.
Yeah, I want to kind of back up what Sean is saying here, actually, because I think it is possible that we could end up with a deadlock convention in this scenario, but I think the talk of a deadlock convention is vastly, vastly overrated. It's fascinating to think about. Almost certainly won't happen. And the reason I say that is because if you look back, you can find so many forgotten moments from modern political history where at roughly this point in either party's nominating contest, there was rampant talk about if Bill Clinton doesn't win the New York primary against Jerry Brown, the Democrats are going to revolt and there will be a brokered convention. We have been here 8 times since 1976.
I'm putting too much emphasis on Michigan.
I think Michigan is important but overstated. I think it'll still be a long, hard slog to the nomination for Mitt Romney. But I wanted to ask Sean Spicer, if I might, does the flood of super PAC money that we're only beginning to see, Mr. Spicer, make the RNC obsolete?
I actually don't first of all, when you look at the total amount raised, and I'm not demeaning, I think super PACs have a role in this cycle, but when you look at the RNC last year raised $87 million. We have $23 million in the bank. Most of those super PACs haven't even come close to what the RNC has been able to raise or do. So in terms of the total amount of money, which I think is what you're driving at, Katrina,
and influence in terms of the primary season, which we've seen so clearly with Mitt Romney's money and then Shelley Adelson and keeping it alive.
Well, I mean, are they playing a role? Absolutely. But the RNC, that again, you're talking about the primary and the choosing of the nominee. That's not a role that we would play in any way, in any fashion anyway. So I think from that standpoint, you know, does it play a role to help or hinder some of these candidates? Sure. From our standpoint, looking forward to the general election, however, I think that we have demonstrated not only our ability to raise the money that's needed, we've outraised the Democratic National Committee for the most part several of the last months. When you look yesterday, when all the candidates filed, the RNC and the Republican candidates raised more money than Obama and the DNC by a lot.
Can I? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just want, before you run out of time, I wanted to ask you about Rick Santorum and social issues, because, you know, even some of his own people have talked about how he's moved the focus off of the economy and onto social issues. Let me play you just a couple of highlights from some of the things that Rick Santorum has said, and then I'll ask you the question on the other side.
I can't and I won't check my faith at the door, because it motivates me to do things that I believe are best for our country.
I do not believe life begins at conception. I know life begins at conception.
I do have concerns about women in frontline combat. I think that could be a very compromising situation. I don't believe in man-made global warming.
So a Santorum strategist said that he thinks the social issues are overshadowing the economy, and certainly in the last week and a half we've seen that. Do you think that that's a bad strategy or a winning strategy? He's rising the polls.
Well, I'll go back to something I said earlier. I'm not going to give each one of these candidates advice. They're going to decide for themselves how they're going to run their campaigns. But I do think from a Republican standpoint, social issues have always been a huge part of the Republican Party. And I think, you know, whether or not it's the question of life or, you know, some of the other issues, I think social issues have been important to not only the Republican Party, the conservative movement, and I think to some degree, largely the electorate, the general election electorate as well. So again, I'm not going to decide which candidate is you know, using social issues more or less, but I think there's no question that social issues are a part of the Republican Party's message. But I think at the end of the day, this is going to be an economic election and a referendum on whether Barack Obama has, you know, kept his promises to turn this economy around, bring jobs home, deal with the debt and the deficit.
Sean Spicer joining us this morning. He's a communications director for the RNC. It's nice to have you. Thanks for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Soledad.
You bet.